Hello. Welcome to Gender Relations and Economics, a video series where we talk about the many ways that gender relations interacts with the economy and how the economy and economics affect gender relations. Today, we're going to talk about gender budgeting or gender responsive budgeting. This is a topic that is a big deal in feminist economics and matters a lot when we think about how gender and the economy are related. And it's not necessarily my field of expertise, but it has come up so many times in the last couple of months that I just thought I have to do a video. Also, my students are really interested in this topic, so I'm happy to produce something. Because it's not my total area of expertise, I spoke with two experts that are going to guide us through some information about gender budgeting, what it is, how it works, and give us some really good examples.
So I'm Tobias Preutzer from Germany, and I did my PhD here at WU Vienna in the Institute for Public Management and Governance. Then I kind of slipped a bit away from the public management sphere towards accounting. So I spent for 6 years in the UK in several universities doing hardcore private sector accounting, but then I got the opportunity to come back to WU since January at the Institute for Organization Studies.
My name is Katharina Made, and I'm an economist, and I've been working at the WU for, I'm not going to say more than 10 years, and I just recently moved to Chamber of Labor, AK, and I'm working there at the women's department. I've been researching on gender issues and feminist issues at the WU, and I've been doing this, or I'm trying to do this at the Chamber of Labor as well now.
Well, it actually came out of a student project. We had students that were looking at all the regular impact assessments of new laws. Is there a gender topic? Is a gender analysis being done in those impact assessments? And are concrete measures being proposed?
I finished my studies early 2000s, and there was a huge movement back then within the civil society, really, to understand public budgeting and its impact on women, especially because there was a deficit reducing public spending discussions back then, and there was this civil society movement that said, well, that's fine, that's a public or a political objective, whatever, but there are impacts on women because of that, and we have to analyze that. I was kind of searching for topics on gender issues, and I found this gender budgeting issue back then, and it was really interesting and it was really empowering. But then I kind of followed the development since then, and it kind of
What gender budgeting is it's a focus on how the budget of a government, of a country, of a state, how that budget and how government money is being used affects gender inequality or gender equality. So if you remember my video on feminist economics, a key principle of feminist economics is that it has a normative aspect to it, that we're in feminist economics, we're not just looking to describe how the world is, but we're also trying to come up with ways to make it better. And gender equality from a feminist point of view is certainly something that would be an improvement to the world. And so gender budgeting is a tool that can be used to help improve gender equality. To understand more about what exactly gender budgeting is and how it works, I'm going to go through 3 things in this video. 1, talk about why gender budgeting can be, and is important for achieving more gender equality in economic relations. Talk about how exactly gender budgeting works, gender responsive budgeting works. And I'll give some examples. And there are some really great examples out there of how it works. One, by the way, is in my video on gender relations and macroeconomics. I briefly introduce gender budgeting at the end of that video. The example I give there is about stickers for priority seating in public transportation. It might be a nice way to start. So why is gender budgeting important? The main idea here is really that we want to expose and understand existing inequalities in the budget, in how governments are spending money. We need to know how policies, economic policies and social policies are affecting different people, and budgetary policies are certainly part of that. So we want to look at how money being spent or money being not spent is affecting gender equality and inequality.
I would say the big remit that gender budgeting has is that it's driving, or it's aiming to drive towards more equity in society in general. Yeah. So and that's why these initiatives are kind of welcoming, very welcome in my view. Gender budgeting kind of helps practitioners to think about what are the tools, how to measure spending in government for different people. Groups, disabilities, minorities, access to health and well-being, education.
Gender budgeting is about making evidence-based decisions. So we look at policies, how they're done, and then we analyze them to say, are these policies helping or hurting gender equality, or are they not affecting gender equality at all? So we're really using the evidence of the policies to help us improve the policies. The 2019 book Invisible Women by Criado Perez gives so many examples of how gender blind budgets, so budgets created without looking at effects on gender equality, there's so many of them, and gender budgeting is an effort to try to raise awareness about this issue. Gender budgeting is also about making policies more efficient. It's about creating policies that more effectively reach the people who need the policies to help them. Something I really like about gender budgeting is that it really actively encourages awareness about how government spending and state spending affects our own lives, because it really shows us that, cities, states, federal governments are making decisions about money, which comes from taxes, how that money is being used to affect our lives. And when we have this gender budgeting perspective, then we can really say, is this policy actually something that I want? Gender responsive budgeting makes it very clear that policies are things that can be changed and should be analyzed from the point of view of how helpful are they.
I think it can change the whole perspective of public spending and public finances, and it can change the whole perspective on why we do want to pay taxes and what we need to have spending at, and that we need to have spending in those care jobs like kindergartens and and the whole range of care activities. And we know from especially the participatory budgets in South America that people start to realize that budgets do matter for them as well, and for their lives and for their realities. And that's when changes in budgetary policies really start, because people start to figure out, well, that's something that's interesting and that's something I need to know. And we see, especially in the European countries, that budgets are something that very little people can read and understand. And that's something that is not by chance, but it is a public and policy instrument that people want you to understand and or not understand. And I guess that's something that gender budgeting could really have effects on, that people can understand budgets, people can understand that most of public policy is related to budgets and needs income from some kind, and that would change our whole narrative on taxation and why we don't want to pay taxes. When you start to realize, well, that's all there in the budget and that's all needed. And I mean, we've seen it with this virus now, how much money can just be located within a few moments.
When people are more involved in this process and more aware of the effects of government spending, then they can more effectively communicate their needs and their wishes and what they want to happen with the money that's there ultimately for them. That also makes the government more accountable, by the way, when more people are involved and aware. So ultimately, the importance of gender budgeting is really that it's looking at the lived experiences of people, of the groups of people, of men and women, and saying, how is the money that we're spending, that we are collecting through taxes and then spending, how is that affecting different groups? And the focus is on lived experiences, which is a core tenet of feminist economics. Yeah. What's one of your favorite examples of gender budgeting?
Well, I used to work at the Viennese administration, and I was there when they started piloting all those gender budgeting initiatives, and I've had some of the most horrendous, I suppose, stories. One of them was cemeteries. They told us they had no clue why they should do something like gender budgeting, because the ones that they care for are the dead ones. And so they have no idea whether that's an instrument for them or not. And we're like, well, can you think about the people that come there and that have to do all the flowers and whatever? And they're like, yeah, that's elderly women. And we're like, yeah, what do they need? And they're like, interesting. So that was funny to see how far away administration really is from the people that they're doing things for. And gender budgeting was an instrument for them to kind of realize, well, there are actual people somewhere in the line, and we're doing our work not just for us or for whatever public idea, but for real people.
So how does gender budgeting work? And ultimately, this is really about including gender at every single step of the budgetary process. In the budgetary process, we have strategic planning, thinking about what has to be done. We have budgeting, so actually coming up with the allocation of the money, implementing that allocation, implementing that budgeting, and then ultimately evaluating, was that effective? Did we accomplish the goals that we wanted to accomplish? In the first stage, strategic planning and strategy planning, we're really considering the question, what is it that we want to do? What do we want to achieve? We maybe have this particular problem that we want to solve, or we want to proactively do something. This asks, what are our goals and how do we get there? And how can we use this money to help us meet our goals? Importantly, gender budgeting includes an intersectional perspective, because we're thinking about the goals that we have for people of demographics. So we're looking not just at men and women in general, which is already a positive step, but we're also thinking about these groups by age, by migration background, socioeconomic background, ethnicity, and thinking about what particular needs these intersectional groups need. A really important aspect, of course, of strategic planning, what do we even need, is, of course, having enough data. So we need data on the lived experiences of people in different groups. We need data to measure problems even. And data is so often in economic analysis and in policy, a missing piece that would be really important to have more of. A gender budgeting lens pushes us to say, there's no compromising. We need to collect these data. We need the data disaggregated by gender and by other groups so that we know what we need to do. So for example, if you have surveys about how people are experiencing their neighborhoods or funding, things like that, if that survey is in a language that certain people don't speak, those people will not be represented. And so all of these different elements of representation in the data need to be considered. And that's a really core part of gender budgeting, that we really need to know what's going on and we need data for that. So after we do the strategic planning and we think about what are our goals, how might we get there, we sit down and actually write the budget. What are the things that we actually want to spend money on? How do we want to allocate funds? In the budgeting phase, this is where we go from sort of our long-term goals, what we want to achieve ultimately, where we come up with the actual concrete steps, the short-run goals, the things that we actually have to do to meet the goals that we've articulated in the strategic planning. And this is the actual on-the-ground work, coming up with ideas of how do we create spending that is going to help us achieve more gender equality. This is where we get to the specifics of the policies we need. Great, so then we've come up with our budget and it's time to implement it. And this is where we actually take our plan to the streets, we implement it, we send the money and spend the money where we said we were going to. Ideally, this implementation comes with feedback loops so that we're spending the money and we're seeing along the way how the spending is affecting the populations that we want it to affect. So it's not just a one-shot change your spending, but that even there within the implementation with very short-run changes, we can make changes. And then after some time, we evaluate the effect of our budget, of our spending. And we, from a gender-responsive budgeting point of view, there we're really looking at, did this spending, did this budgeting affect gender equality as planned? Did it do what we want it to do? Were there any unexpected benefits maybe that came out of it? What did we learn? Were there unintended consequences that might have been negative? What do we need to change next time to do better? What challenges did we face in implementing the budget this way? What do we have to learn for the future? Again, this evaluation depends so much on data. At this point, I want to just recommend the book Data Feminism, which gives so many examples of how to collect and analyze data. Gender responsive budgeting is a long process. We've come up with our goals, we've come up with our budget, we've implemented and we've evaluated. And what do we do now? We do the whole thing again. Ideally, we're constantly building in feedback. What have we learned and what can we do better? Okay, so now you know the theory of how gender budgeting works, what the idea is behind it. Let's talk about some examples of gender budgeting, what works well, what's worked not so well. And a really important thing to notice here is that the institutional context in which different budgeting, gender responsive budgeting takes place really matters. So the idea of, okay, let's include gender equality in the budget, pretty broad idea, and the actual implementation will really vary depending on institutional context.
So we were producing two literature reviews, one focusing in particular on emerging economies, and least developed countries, and another one that was more general about gender budgeting, because in emerging economies, things are a bit different in the sense that informal economies are much bigger in emerging economies, and who is running the informal economies? It's mostly women. So that's kind of the way to go to. In emerging economies, we also have less developed public financial management systems. So reforms start at a kind of a lower level than in minority or first world countries. Lower capacities for data analytics. So that was kind of interesting when we were looking at gender budgeting initiatives in those two countries.
So to be more specific, let's look at 3 countries in particular and check out how their gender budgeting has been going on. First, Austria, because gender budgeting is part of the constitution of Austria, and Austria actually gets a lot of media representation as a great example of gender budgeting. We'll look at Sweden, where there's actually no law requiring a gender-specific view of the budgeting, but where there's a very high level of political commitment to doing it. And we'll also look at Great Britain, in which there's no law to do gender budgeting and the government doesn't really engage in gender budgeting, but there's a very, very high level of civic engagement and organizations in Great Britain under analyzing and understanding the budget from a gender-specific point of view. So first, Austria. Gender budgeting is part of the constitution in Austria and part of budgetary law. And in the media, Austria is really seen as this gender budgeting oasis. Let's check out if that's really the case.
Like in 2009, there was an amendment to the constitution that put outcome orientation in kind of as a principle for budgetary management, outcome orientation, and then also taking into account the objective, like of actual equality, it's put there, of women and men. So this was kind of a shift in thinking how how public financial management works, yeah, because like in a classic sense, yeah. Parliaments would budget in an input logic, yeah, kind of there is a cash, yeah, we define some goals, yeah, and then we assign some cash for a program X, yeah, and like since the 1990s in Austria, like 1980s, 1970s in the Anglo-Saxon state, there has been kind of this shift in focus, yeah, so no longer an input logic, but more like the focus on outputs and outcomes. So not only more how much are we spending on program X, but kind of what are the outputs that are being delivered by this program X, yeah, and what are the outcomes in society, yeah, and of course this enables us to make some more detailed analysis by gender. There are now a lot of reports where we actually know what are the effects on women. One of the things were in culture, yeah, like there were specific funds for female film directors, yeah, kind of how to promote female film directors. So from culture, yeah, in the agriculture, yeah, kind of how many farms are being run by women, yeah, and what are the programs there, yeah. And I think I had a third one, like in research, yeah, if we talk about grant applications. So what is the percentage of women that are principal investigators, so the main investigators on these grants? This gender budgeting does something, kind of pushes the concept into more, at least federal government reporting.
I guess it's time in Austria not to look at the law and taking ourselves back and telling everybody, but it's in our law, we're the best because we did it, and start like doing something with that instrument. I think one of the things that is really missing in Austria is the overall agenda, the overall feminist, gender-specific aim. So there is no such thing as where to work towards. Like there is no idea of why we're doing this, because they don't see the importance and they don't see the overall aim. That's something. And the other thing is that there is no consequences, there is no sanctions, there is no consequences. So whether they do it or they do it wrong or they do it with no aims, with no aims really. Some of the things that administration is doing now is like really stepping over a hurdle, kind of like, oops, we did it. So whether they do it or they don't, there are no sanctions, and there is no such ministry that takes over responsibility, because the women's ministry has always said that they don't have the resources for administrating it or for sanctioning it, and the finance ministry is kind of like, yeah, whatever. So yeah, they're not taking over control either.
So let's look at Sweden now, our second case. So again, in Sweden, there's really no legal framework to do gender budgeting. There's no legal requirement, but there's a very high political commitment to analyzing the budget from a gender-specific point of view.
We know that they do a lot within the administration, but we have no or not enough information on what has actually changed. But that's the countries where there is a huge tradition on gender equality, on gender policies. So that's why I would say gender budgeting is another instrument for them, and that's helping for them, but it's not the important instrument as it would be in Austria.
One tool that Sweden uses that Austria doesn't use is an ex-ante gender analysis of all major policies. Austria does this for some policies, but Sweden, despite the lack of law requiring this to be the case, Sweden does a gender-specific analysis of all major policies before putting them into place. A somewhat famous example, because of the book Invisible Women, is snow clearing, where we see that men and women use roads and sidewalks differently and at different times. And snow clearing that was focused on clearing the streets for cars disproportionately benefited men. And the routes that women took, namely mostly sidewalks, walking around, walking with strollers, when the sidewalks weren't cleared from snow, that women were, of course, disproportionately affected. And this also increased the probability of accidents, which increased medical costs, people having to go to the hospital because they slipped on the ice while walking. When Sweden analyzed this policy from a gender-specific point of view, they realized, oh, we have to change that. So now sidewalks and bike paths are cleared before the time of day that people have to leave to take their kids to school. Women have to leave to take their kids to school. Finally, let's look at the UK, where there's no commitment from the government to implement gender budgeting, but there's a very, very high level of civic commitment.
Well, I think one of the countries to look at has always been the UK, because there is this civil society organization, the Women's Budget Group, that are responsible for doing gender budgeting. So it's not within the administration, but totally outside. And as far as we know, they have a very good understanding with the Ministry of Finance, and they kind of like the external resources for the administration and for the Ministry of Finance. So whether there is some kind of changes in taxation, they do the research and they provide the studies to show what the impacts on women and men are, and the Ministry of Finance then decides whether to go through with the taxation changes or not. And as far as we know from the outside, they have been able to change policies really. And they did a few years ago, they did huge study on intra-household effects of taxation, and they could stop a policy with that. So that's something where I would look at. And I mean, they have this tradition since the 1980s, end of the 1980s, where they do gender budgeting.
The Women's Budget Group is a really interesting organization. Totally recommend that you check it out. Each of these approaches has some particular merits. First, a legal requirement for gender budgeting could be important so that the gender responsive budgeting process doesn't stop if there's a change of power in the government. The political commitment to gender budgeting is really important so that the goals defined and articulated in the budgetary phase are ambitious and set up to be effective. But as we saw from the UK, civic engagement is a really important aspect of gender budgeting as well. And it's civic engagement that really helps us understand people's lived realities that makes us know what budget should even be aiming to do. So there you have a summary of the main ideas, a few examples of gender budgeting. There's really so much out there on this topic. It's kind of a hot topic these days. You can check out the video description for a list of further reading. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video on gender relations and economics.